There's a photograph from 1929 that hangs in the basement archives of the Ashford Historical Society in Salem, Massachusetts. Most people walk right past it, but those who stop to look closely notice something unsettling. 37 faces stare back from the faded sepia tones, all residents of the old Mercy Hill boarding house. They're arranged in neat rows, some smiling, some stern, frozen in that moment nearly a century ago. What makes this photograph truly horrifying isn't what you can see. It's what happened exactly 1 week after it was taken. Every single person in that photograph died on the same night in the same way, and nobody could explain how or why. Before we dive into this chilling tale, if you love mysteries that blur the line between history and horror, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about the past. This is the story of the Mercy Hill photograph and the curse that still haunts Salem to this very day. The boarding house stood on the corner of Mercy Hill Road and Gallows Street, an unfortunate intersection if you knew Salem's dark history. The building itself was unremarkable, a three-story Victorian structure with peeling white paint and black shutters that rattled in the wind. In 1929, it housed an eclectic mix of residents: dock workers, seamstresses, a former vaudeville performer, a widowed schoolteacher, and even a traveling salesman who decided to settle down. The landlady, Margaret Holloway, ran a tight ship. She was a severe woman in her 50s, always dressed in black, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. She had one rule above all others: no photographs inside the house. She claimed it was superstition, something about capturing souls, but most residents thought she was just eccentric. That rule was broken on October 23, 1929. A traveling photographer named Edmund Price arrived in Salem, offering to take group portraits for a reduced rate. He was drumming up business before the stock market crash that would come just 6 days later, though of course nobody knew that yet. Edmund was charming and persuasive, and he convinced Margaret to gather all her tenants for a photograph on the front steps. It was early evening, the light perfect, casting long shadows across the porch. Margaret reluctantly agreed, though several tenants later reported that she seemed agitated, almost frightened, as they assembled. Edmund set up his large format camera on its wooden tripod, disappearing beneath the black cloth to compose the shot. He emerged with a smile, counted to 3, and captured the image with a brilliant flash of powder. The photograph shows them all clearly. In the front row sits Margaret herself, hands folded primly in her lap, her face expressing something between resignation and dread. Behind her stands Thomas Brennan, a dock worker with massive shoulders and calloused hands. Beside him is little Sarah Chen, the 8-year-old daughter of the building's only Chinese family, her face bright with excitement at being photographed. There's Eleanor Frost, the former vaudeville dancer, still beautiful at 42. Father Michael Corrigan, a defrocked priest who never spoke of why he left the church. The Kowalski brothers, identical twins who worked at the textile mill. On and on. 37 souls arranged like a macabre yearbook. If you look very closely at the photograph, which hangs behind protective glass now, you can see something odd in the background. In the upper right window of the 3rd floor, there appears to be another face, pale and indistinct, though the Historical Society insists that room was empty and under renovation at the time. Edmund Price packed up his equipment that evening and promised to deliver the prints within a week. He lodged at a hotel downtown, the Hawthorne Inn, which still operates today, though under different management. According to the hotel register, which still exists, Edmund seemed troubled after developing the plates. He told the desk clerk that something was wrong with the negative, that there were marks he couldn't explain, shadows that shouldn't exist. The clerk dismissed it as artist's temperament. Edmund was seen in his room that night, pacing back and forth, the silhouette visible through his curtained window. One guest reported hearing him muttering prayers in Latin, which seemed strange for a photographer. By morning, he had checked out abruptly, leaving behind several developed prints of the Mercy Hill photograph, but taking the glass plate negative with him. He was never seen in Salem again. Margaret received the photographs 3 days later, delivered by post. She brought them into the boarding house that evening, October 26th, and distributed them among the residents who had gathered in the common room. The reaction was immediate and disturbing. Several people gasped. Others went pale. Thomas Brennan dropped his copy as if it had burned him. What they saw in those photographs differed slightly from person to person, but everyone agreed on one thing: something was wrong. Some claimed they could see additional figures in the background that hadn't been there during the shoot. Others swore the expressions on faces had changed, that people who were smiling now looked terrified. Little Sarah Chen began to cry and pointed at the third-floor window, where that pale face was clearly visible, and she insisted it was watching them. Margaret tried to calm everyone, but she was shaken too. She gathered all the copies of the photograph and announced she would burn them immediately. Several residents protested, wanting to keep their copies, but Margaret was adamant. She went to the kitchen, fired up the iron stove, and fed the photographs into the flames one by one. Witnesses said the pictures didn't burn normally. They curled and blackened, but some claimed to see the faces in the photograph moving, mouths opening in silent screams as the fire consumed them. The smoke that rose from the stove was thick and black and smelled wrong, not like burning paper, but like something organic, something that had once been alive. Margaret burned every copy she could find, or so she thought. That night, October 26th, was quiet in the boarding house. Most residents went to bed early, unsettled by the day's events. The only unusual occurrence was reported by Henry Walsh, a night watchman at the nearby dock, who walked past Mercy Hill around midnight. He later told police that every window in the boarding house was dark, except for one on the third floor, the same room that had been empty during the photograph. That window glowed with a sickly yellowish light, and he could swear he saw figures moving behind the glass, though they moved in strange, jerking motions, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Henry hurried past, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. October 27th dawned gray and cold. The milkman arrived at Mercy Hill at 6 in the morning, as he did every day. He left 4 bottles on the front step and noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because Margaret was meticulous about security. He called out, but received no answer. The paperboy came by at 7 and also noticed the open door. By 8 o'clock, a postal worker delivering mail became concerned enough to push the door open and call inside. The silence that greeted him was absolute and oppressive, the kind of silence that feels alive, that presses against your eardrums. He stepped inside. The common room was exactly as it had been left the night before. A book lay open on a side table. A knitting project sat abandoned in a chair, but there were no people. The postal worker climbed the stairs, calling out, becoming more frightened with each step. On the second floor, he found the first body. Eleanor Frost lay in the hallway outside her room, her door standing open behind her. She was still in her nightgown, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, her eyes bulging, her mouth stretched wide in a scream that had never found voice. Her hands were raised as if warding something off. But there were no marks on her body, no signs of violence, no indication of what had killed her. The postal worker stumbled backward, knocking over a small table, and ran for the police. Within 30 minutes, Salem's small police force had descended on Mercy Hill boarding house. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Every single resident was dead. All 37 people from the photograph. They were scattered throughout the building, in bedrooms, in hallways, in the kitchen, and the parlor. Thomas Brennan was found in his room, his massive body curled into a fetal position in the corner, as if he'd been trying to make himself small, trying to hide from something. The Kowalski twins were in their shared room, both pressed against opposite walls, as far from each other as they could get, their faces masks of terror. Little Sarah Chen was under her bed, her small hand reaching out as if trying to grasp something, or perhaps push something away. Father Michael Corrigan was found in the basement, clutching a crucifix so tightly it had cut into his palms. The blood had run down his wrists and dripped onto the floor where he knelt. On the wall behind him, written in that blood, were 3 words in Latin: Imago animam capit. The photograph captures the soul. Margaret Holloway was in her own room on the first floor, sitting upright in her bed, her eyes open but seeing nothing. In her hands she clutched a small leather journal that police would later discover contained disturbing entries about the house's history. Every single victim displayed the same cause of death, or rather, the same impossible lack of cause. The coroner, Dr. Harrison Webb, conducted the autopsies personally. He found nothing. No poison, no disease, no physical trauma of any kind. Their hearts had simply stopped, all at the same moment, sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning. 37 people, ranging in age from 8 to 60, 4, in various states of health, had all died of simultaneous cardiac arrest with no medical explanation. The investigation that followed became one of the strangest in Massachusetts history. Police searched the boarding house top to bottom. They found no signs of gas leak, no evidence of mass poisoning, no indication of any substance that could have killed everyone simultaneously. The case attracted attention from Boston newspapers, and theories ranged from the mundane to the bizarre. Some suggested contaminated water, though the supply tested clean. Others proposed carbon monoxide, but there was no source. A few whispered about mass suicide or even murder, but there was no evidence supporting either theory, no note, no method, no motive. The case was officially classified as unexplained deaths due to unknown causes, a designation that satisfied no one but was the only honest conclusion available. What the police didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was what Margaret had written in her journal in the days before her death. The journal was entered into evidence, but largely overlooked in the chaos of the investigation. It wasn't until years later that a researcher stumbled upon it in the archives and recognized its significance. Margaret's entries revealed a terrible history. The boarding house, she wrote, had been built on land that was part of the original Salem witch trial executions. Not the famous Gallows Hill where most accused were hanged, but a smaller site where 3 women were executed in secret. Their trials never recorded, their names erased from history. These women, Margaret claimed, had been genuine practitioners of the old ways, and their final curse before death was specific and terrible. Anyone who captured their image would capture their rage, and that rage would eventually consume those who dared to preserve what should remain forgotten. Margaret had known this when she bought the property in 1915. She'd found documents in the deed, old papers that spoke of the land's dark history. That's why she'd forbidden photographs in the house. She believed, truly believed, that creating images of the living in that cursed place would invoke something ancient and hungry. The journal entries from the week after the photograph was taken descended into paranoia and terror. Margaret wrote about hearing footsteps in empty rooms, about seeing shadows move independently of any light source, about waking in the night to find 3 women standing around her bed, their faces pale as milk, their eyes black pits, their mouths moving in silent accusations. She wrote that the photograph had opened a door, had given form to something formless, had provided a bridge between the world of the dead and the living. In her final entry, dated October 26th, written just hours before her death, Margaret described looking at one of the photographs she had tried to burn. She'd discovered that one had survived, tucked behind a bookshelf where it had fallen. When she picked it up, she wrote, "The image had changed completely. The faces were no longer those of her tenants, but of the 3 executed women, and behind them, the third floor window showed not an empty room, but a gallows, and hanging from that gallows were 37 bodies, swaying gently, though there was no wind. She wrote that she understood then that the photograph wasn't a capture of a moment, but a prophecy, a prediction, a curse made manifest. She ended with a simple statement: "We are all in the photograph now, and the photograph will not let us go." The surviving photograph that Margaret mentioned was never found. Police searched the boarding house thoroughly, but if it existed, it had vanished. Or perhaps someone found it and, recognizing its significance, destroyed it or kept it hidden. The mystery deepened when Edmund Price's fate came to light. Investigators trying to track down the photographer discovered that he had died on October 27th, the same night as the boarding house residents. He'd been found in his hotel room in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, dead of the same mysterious cardiac arrest. His camera smashed to pieces on the floor beside him, and the glass plate negative of the Mercy Hill photograph shattered into so many fragments it could never be reconstructed. On his desk was a note that read simply, "I should never have taken their picture. I should never have looked through the lens. I saw them. God help me, I saw them watching." The Mercy Hill boarding house stood empty for years after the tragedy. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to rent it. Local children dared each other to approach it on Halloween, claiming you could hear screams from inside, that you could see faces in the windows, that if you knocked on the door 3 times, you would hear someone knock back from the other side. In 1937, the building burned down under mysterious circumstances. Firefighters reported that the blaze started simultaneously on all 3 floors, which was physically impossible, and that the flames seemed to resist water, burning with unusual intensity. When the ruins cooled, they found something disturbing in the basement. Arranged in a neat circle were 37 small piles of ash, human ash, though the coroner insisted all the bodies from 1929 had been properly buried in the municipal cemetery. In the center of the circle, untouched by flame, was a photograph. This photograph was not the group portrait from 1929, or rather, it was and it wasn't. It showed the same people, the same arrangement, but the image had changed. Every face displayed the expression of terror that the bodies had worn in death, and the 3rd floor window was clearly visible, and in that window stood 3 women in old-fashioned dress, and they were smiling. The fire chief, a man named Robert Mackenzie, took the photograph to his superior officer, who promptly locked it in the evidence room at the police station. It remained there for 15 years until the station was renovated and the evidence room contents were transferred. Photograph vanished during that transfer, and no one could explain how or where it went. Some say it was deliberately destroyed. Others claim it was stolen by a collector of macabre memorabilia. Few whisper that it walked away on its own, that cursed objects have a way of finding new victims. But the story doesn't end there. The land where Mercy Hill boarding house stood remained empty for decades, an eyesore in the middle of Salem, a weed-choked lot that real estate developers avoided despite its prime location. In 1982, a young couple from Boston, unaware of the history, purchased the land and announced plans to build a modern apartment complex. Construction began in the spring of 1983. Workers immediately reported strange occurrences. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Shadows moved across the ground when there was nothing to cast them. Several workers quit after claiming to see faces in the dirt, watching them from beneath the ground. The foreman, a skeptical man named James Delacroix, dismissed these reports as superstition until August 12, 1983. On that day, workers excavating for the foundation unearthed something that stopped construction immediately. 3 feet below the surface, they found a layer of bones, Not ancient bones, not Native American remains, but relatively recent skeletons, and there were 3 of them, arranged in a triangular pattern. Forensic examination revealed they were the remains of 3 adult women, and carbon dating suggested they were approximately 300 years old. But here's what was truly disturbing. Clutched in the skeletal hands of each woman was a small, perfectly preserved photograph. Not an old photograph, not a sepia-toned antique, but a modern Polaroid photograph showing the construction site, showing the workers, showing James Delacroix himself staring at the camera with an expression of horror. The photographs were dated August 12, 1983, the same day they were found. The project was immediately shut down. The bones were removed for study, though they vanished from the medical examiner's office before any conclusive analysis could be completed. The photographs were confiscated by police, and then, like the original Mercy Hill photograph, disappeared from evidence. James Delacroix refused to work on the site again, and eventually left Salem entirely. The land was sold and remains empty to this day. A chain-link fence surrounds it, plastered with no trespassing signs, though the fence is regularly cut and repaired. Local teenagers still dare each other to enter the lot at night, and some claim that if you stand in the exact center where the boarding house once stood, you can feel the ground vibrating beneath your feet, as if something is trying to push up from below. The Ashford Historical Society obtained the surviving copy of the Mercy Hill photograph in 1995 from an anonymous donor who included a note warning them never to reproduce it, never to photograph it, never to create any image of the image itself. The curator at the time, a woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, was skeptical of the warning but followed the donor's instructions out of respect. The photograph was placed in the archives in a special climate-controlled case in the basement, away from public view. Dr. Marsh died in 1998 of a sudden heart attack while working late in the archives. She was found the next morning by a janitor, slumped over her desk, a photograph clutched in her hand. It was a self-portrait she'd apparently taken with a Polaroid camera, showing herself sitting at the desk in the archives. But in the background of the photograph, clearly visible on the wall behind her, was the Mercy Hill photograph, and in the third-floor window of the boarding house, the 3 women were no longer smiling. They were reaching out of the photograph, their arms extending impossibly into Dr. Marsh's office, their fingers inches from her head. The current curator, Thomas Ashford, refuses to discuss the Mercy Hill photograph with the public. He insists it remains in the archives, sealed and preserved, but he won't show it to anyone, won't allow it to be studied or examined. Some researchers have accused him of hiding important historical evidence, of allowing superstition to interfere with scholarship. But those who have worked with Thomas, who have seen the fear in his eyes when the photograph is mentioned, suspect he knows something, has seen something, that he's protecting people from a danger they can't understand. There are rumors that he visits the archives late at night, that he stands in front of the sealed case containing the photograph and speaks to it, apologizing, pleading, promising to keep it hidden forever if only it will stay contained. In 2015, a graduate student named Amanda Pierce gained special permission to study the Ashford Historical Society archives for her thesis on Salem's post-witch trial history. She was granted access to most materials, but specifically forbidden from viewing or referencing the Mercy Hill photograph. Amanda was an ambitious student, frustrated by these restrictions, and one evening when Thomas had left for the day, she used her access key to enter the archives alone. She found the sealed case, picked the lock with a hairpin, and photographed the Mercy Hill photograph with her smartphone, taking multiple high-resolution images. She uploaded them to her laptop for study and left the archives, satisfied with her rebellious scholarship. Amanda didn't come to class the next day. Her advisor tried calling, got no answer, and eventually contacted police. They found Amanda in her apartment, sitting at her desk, her laptop open in front of her, displaying one of the photographs she'd taken. She was dead, cause unknown, though her expression suggested she'd died in terror. But here's what made the police officers stumble backward, what made them call in experts, what eventually led to the case being sealed under mysterious circumstances. Amanda's laptop showed the photograph, but it was changing. As police watched, the image on the screen shifted and moved like a video, though it was definitely a still photograph. The faces in the Mercy Hill photograph turned to look directly at the camera, directly at Amanda, directly at anyone looking at the screen. The three women in the third-floor window stepped forward, emerging from the building, walking down the steps toward the camera, toward Amanda, toward whoever dared to look. One officer, thinking quickly, slammed the laptop shut and pulled the battery. But when crime scene investigators examined the device later, they found that every digital file had been corrupted beyond recovery. The photographs Amanda had taken no longer existed in any retrievable form. Her smartphone, when police located it in her bag, would not power on and showed signs of massive electrical damage despite being fully charged when last used. More disturbingly, when police canvassed Amanda's apartment building, 3 neighbors reported the same strange occurrence. At approximately 1 in the morning, they'd heard Amanda scream, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps in her apartment. When they'd looked into the hallway, concerned, they'd seen 3 women in old-fashioned dress walking away from Amanda's door, though they'd heard no door open or close. The women had turned to look at the neighbors, had smiled, and then had simply vanished, fading into nothing like smoke in wind. The official report stated that Amanda had died of natural causes, a heart defect that had gone undetected. Her family accepted this explanation, though they couldn't explain why Amanda's belongings, when packed up from her apartment, included a photograph that none of them had ever seen before. It was tucked into her desk drawer, a sepia-owned print showing the Mercy Hill boarding house residence. In the photograph, clearly visible among the 37 faces, was Amanda herself, her expression frozen in terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, standing in the third-floor window where the 3 women used to be. Thomas Ashford reinforced security on the archives after Amanda's death. The photograph is now kept in a sealed titanium case, locked with a combination known only to Thomas himself. He's arranged for the case to be buried with him when he dies, interred in the Ashford family crypt, sealed away forever. But Thomas has confided to a few trusted colleagues that he fears it won't be enough, that the photograph exists beyond the physical print, that it's become something more than paper and chemicals and light. He believes the act of taking the photograph in 1929 created a permanent wound in reality, a thin place where the dead can reach through and touch the living, and that every subsequent image, every copy, every photograph of the photograph, widens that wound a little more. There are those in Salem who believe the Mercy Hill photograph is merely the most famous example of a larger phenomenon, that certain places hold certain curses, that images captured in these places carry those curses forward, infecting everyone who views them. They point to other examples, a tintype from the 1860s that shows Civil War soldiers, all of whom died within hours of the photograph being taken, killed not by enemy fire, but by sudden, simultaneous seizures. A photograph from the 1950s showing a children's birthday party, after which every child in the picture developed the same rare form of cancer within a year. A selfie taken at a concert in 2010, in the background of which appears a figure no one remembers being there, and within a week, the person who took the selfie and everyone visible in the frame had vanished without a trace. But these are just stories, whispers, urban legends that proliferate in the age of digital images and viral content. Or are they? In our modern world, we take hundreds, thousands of photographs. We capture every moment, preserve every memory, share every experience. We've lost the old superstitions, the old fears, the old understanding that some things should not be preserved, that some moments should be allowed to fade, that some places should remain unrecorded. We've forgotten that photographs are not merely representations but invocations, that to capture an image is to capture something of the essence of what's photographed. And if that essence is dark, if it's cursed, if it's hungry, then every photograph becomes a doorway. Every screen becomes a window. Every viewer becomes a potential victim. The Mercy Hill photograph still exists, locked away in the darkness of the Ashford Historical Society archives. Thomas Ashford visits it sometimes, late at night, when the building is empty. He stands before the titanium case and listens, because sometimes, in the absolute silence of the basement archives, he can hear them. 37 voices, whispering, crying, screaming without sound. And sometimes, he hears 3 other voices, older voices, women's voices speaking in a language he doesn't understand, but that fills him with primordial dread. They're waiting, he knows. The photograph is waiting. Because curses don't die. They don't fade with time. They wait for someone to look, for someone to see, for someone to be foolish enough, or curious enough, or unlucky enough to open the door that should remain forever sealed. And here's the thing that keeps Thomas awake at night, the thing that haunts him more than anything else. In our digital age, photographs don't die. They're backed up, cloud, stored, cached in servers around the world. Amanda's photographs of the Mercy Hill photograph may have been destroyed on her devices, but what if they were automatically uploaded before she died? What if they exist somewhere in the vast digital ocean of the internet, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be viewed, waiting to find new victims? What if right now, someone is scrolling through archived historical photographs, stumbles across the Mercy Hill image, and thinks nothing of clicking on it, enlarging it, staring into the faces of those 37 doomed souls? The last entry in Margaret Holloway's journal, the one she wrote hours before she died, contained a final warning that police never released to the public. The photograph is a mirror, and mirrors work both ways. When you look into it, something looks back. And once it sees you, once it knows you, once your image is captured in its gaze, you become part of the photograph forever. We're all in the photograph now, all of us who looked, all of us who saw. We're trapped in that moment, in that terrible moment when Edmund Price counted to 3 and captured something that should never have been captured. The flash of powder wasn't just light. It was an announcement, a declaration, a summoning, and they came. The 3 women came, drawn by their own stolen images, drawn by the violation of their cursed ground, drawn by the opportunity for revenge that spans centuries. They're in the photograph now, and the photograph is everywhere, and everywhere the photograph goes, they go too, hunting, claiming, collecting. 37 of us will die tonight, but we won't be the last. The photograph will find others. The photograph will always find others. This is the secret of the 1929 photograph. The truth that Salem has tried to bury for nearly a century. Every person in that photograph died the same way, because they were killed by something that should not exist. Something that photographs themselves can create under the right circumstances, in the right places, with the right darkness waiting to be given form. They died because they looked into a camera and smiled, unaware that the camera was looking back, unaware that behind the lens something ancient and angry was looking through, was reaching through, was claiming them. The Mercy Hill photograph hangs in the darkness of the archives, sealed away but never truly contained, because somewhere, in the vast digital archives of the internet, in the scanning projects of historical societies, in the amateur photograph databases, and genealogy websites, and historical research portals, copies exist. They're out there, waiting to be found, waiting to be viewed, waiting to be shared. And every time someone looks at that photograph, every time someone stares into the faces of those 37 doomed souls, the curse reaches out a little further, the door opens a little wider, and the 3 women in the 3rd floor window smile a little broader. So, if you're ever researching Salem's history, if you're ever browsing through old photographs from the 1920s, if you ever come across a sepia-toned image of 37 people standing in front of a Victorian boarding house, close your browser immediately. Don't enlarge it, don't study the faces, don't look at the 3rd floor window. Because the photograph is looking for you now, has always been looking for you, waiting for you to complete the circuit, to close the loop, to become the next name on the list of those who died the same way, all at once, all together, all claimed by something that lives between the light and lens and the moment captured forever.